The Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a society that was controlled in nearly every part of people's life: politics, economy, education, controlling the media, culture, oppressing religion, banning guns, cracking down on individuals' rights and freedoms. Wait a minute. YouTube, please don't copyright me. We'll first start the scenario during World War I in 1917. After Lenin took power, Russia was still technically at war with Germany despite the regime change, so Lenin decided on adopting a policy of no war and no peace. What this meant was that the Soviets would stop fighting the Germans of World War I, but wouldn't sign a peace treaty in hopes that if and when they start to lose to the Entente, the Soviets would be able to retake the Eastern European territories that Germany controlled. This plan did not work in our timeline, and the Germans took advantage of the Russian situation and pushed further into Eastern Europe, which the Soviets had to reconquer later on. In this timeline, Lenin would personally negotiate alongside his delegation and sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans to end the war on the Eastern Front a year early. The Soviets would still lose Poland, the Baltics, and wouldn't be allowed to intervene in the Finnish Civil War on the side of the Reds, but the Germans wouldn't launch Operation Feuchtschlag, which was the final German advancement in the Eastern Front before eventually losing the war a year later. As a result, the Bolsheviks could focus more on fighting in the Russian Civil War, Eastern Europe would be less devastated, and then after the Russian Civil War is over and the treaties annulled, the Soviets would be able to regain control over those lands much quicker, and they would be less devastated from the German occupation as well. With peace between the Soviets and the Germans established in this timeline, the Germans would not need all their troops to fight in Russia anymore now that they are out of the war, so they would go on to move most of their troops to the Western Front. The Soviets would also not need any troops to deter Germany from invading them, so they would need to go somewhere else, which would be up north. The reason why I'd like the Soviets to focus next on the northern front of the Russian Civil War is to get a better border with Finland so that they could eventually intervene in their civil war. Now, although the treaty that they will sign with Germany in 1917 in this alternate timeline states that they would be forbidden from interfering in the Finnish Civil War, just like they were in our timeline, the Germans wouldn't be in the position to do anything about it. This is because by this point in the Civil War, they would have moved all their troops on the Eastern Front to fight against France, so when the Soviets do start to intervene in the Finnish Civil War, they would have to move all their troops from the Western Front, who already would be struggling against America entering the war in the first place, to start another front with a giant country, for a country that could barely be considered an ally, when they desperately need those troops to fight in the Western Front. So the Germans would be bitter about it, but would just take the loss and focus on the war. So now moving into the Finnish Civil War. It was a very similar conflict to the Russian Revolution, where the Right Finns were fighting against the Red Finns. The Red Finns in our timeline failed, which led to White Finland taking power and fighting the Winter War against the Soviets. In this timeline, after the Soviets take control over the North, they would then be in a stable position to help the Red Finns in January of 1918 when the Finnish Civil War started. In our timeline, Lenin was careful not to get too involved in the war as to avoid provoking Germany, who was supporting the Rights, but in this timeline, the opposite would be true, and the Soviets would fully back the Red Finns, leading to the Whites eventually being defeated and Finland becoming a Soviet Socialist Republic that will eventually be integrated into the Soviet Union. As for the rest of the Russian Civil War itself, we can make some basic changes, like executing the white commander that was leading the resistance in the Caucasus before he escaped, so that way there would be much less organized resistance, and then afterwards pushing into all the Armenian territories, including the ones in the Ottomans, which broke away from them historically during 1918. After this, the Ottomans would have no choice but to accept, because they would be collapsing. Also during the Civil War, instead of trying to disarm the Czechoslovak Legion that ended up taking control over the Siberian Railway, the Soviets could instead grant them safe passage back home to remove them from the Civil War altogether, which will allow the Reds to control most of Siberia much more earlier than they did in our timeline. With the Whites not controlling Siberia, the resistance will remain unconnected and uncoordinated, and then all the Reds have to do from there is just pick off the resistance movements one by one. World War I will end a bit later in this timeline because Germany would have a stronger resistance on the Western Front, after they moved their troops there after signing the peace treaty, but they would still lose with the help from the Americans, and then the Germans would lose influence over the East. By this point in the alternate Russian Revolution, they would have reunified most of the country under communism, except for their Eastern European territories, to officially end the Russian Civil War once and for all. We will have them conquer Ukraine and then deal with Poland, which I already covered in my What If the Soviets Won the Polish-Soviet War video. It's mostly the same thing that I would have covered anyways in today's scenario, but I thought it deserved a video of its own. And what happened in that scenario is basically the same as what will happen in this scenario, where the Soviets win the Battle of Warsaw, and Poland surrenders after, and then with their foothold in Poland, they were able to conquer Eastern Europe through revolution and war, and with the start of a revolution in Germany leading to an alternate World War II, which is where I ended this scenario. If you want more details, I highly suggest watching that video. Anyways, everything that happened in that scenario that I just talked about will happen in this scenario, with the only differences being the Soviets would control Finland, the Caucasus, the Baltics, and Turkish Armenia during this time, and they would also be more powerful coming out of the Civil War, and would be better able to gain control over Eastern Europe compared to the other scenario, and could even gain control over Sweden through the unrest of the Swedish workers were going through at the time, which could eventually lead to a communist revolution funded by the Soviet Union, which leads us to where we left off at the end of this scenario, where the Soviet Union actually starts World War II. Before we talk about that though, I would like to focus on the political changes that would happen beforehand. After Poland and the Baltics are conquered, the Russian Civil War officially ends, and soon after, Lenin passes away and a successor has to be chosen. In this timeline, Stalin, who would become Lenin's successor, had one major thorn in his side, which was Trotsky, who rallied many people against Stalin, causing him to become more paranoid, and as a result, start purging, which led to the unnecessary loss of many Russian lives. In this alternate timeline, in order to prevent these lives from being lost, we need to remove Trotsky from the equation altogether. Trotsky was seen as a military genius, and the face of the Red Army, and he was the one who formed it. So in this alternate scenario, we will simply have Lenin put Trotsky in a position away from politics, where he focuses on building up and reforming the Red Army to become more powerful quicker, which is a position he will remain in for the rest of his life. During his time in this position, he could develop his own version of the blitzkrieg and adjust it for communist revolutions. When the Russians want to spread the revolution to another country, what the Soviets would do is fund communist revolutions across that country, and then use the chaos to then invade that country using the same blitzkrieg method that the Germans would end up using in World War II in our timeline, but instead directed at linking up with communist revolutionaries. By using this method, countries that the Soviets will invade's militaries would be distracted in trying to put down those rebellions, while also creating chaos that the Soviets could control to capitulate that country. This Russian version of the blitzkrieg would be way more effective than the Germans' version of blitzkrieg, which would be used heavily in their expansion. Now that Trotsky has been removed from politics in this timeline, Stalin rises to power much quicker and without any political opposition. There's no one to rally against him, and as a result, he won't do his early purges nearly as much, resulting in many Russian lives being spared, which will be able to help him get this more powerful Soviet Union that he has inherited up and going. With the Civil War ending sooner, much less of the industrial complexes that did exist before the revolution would not be destroyed because of the peace treaty that was signed between the Soviets and the Germans. And with Stalin's easier rise to political prominence, Stalin could focus purely on industrializing the Soviet Union sooner and quicker. Although it would still be a brutal process, Russia would be much better off after the Industrial Revolution than they were in our timeline from this better starting off point. From here, one other change that I would like to have is have Stalin abolish the Soviet Union's framework that existed in our timeline and instead absorb all of the Soviet Socialist republics into one Russian Republic. And the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, will officially be changed to the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or the RSFSR. What this means is that Stalin will have a much easier time governing the Soviet Union because he will have more centralized power that he will be able to handle, and long term, he will no longer have to balance the SSRs against each other, and their ethnic identities and autonomy, which later led to the creation of all of the new countries that gained independence from the Soviet Union in our timeline, would be stripped from them, making it easier to Russify those regions. Over the next century, in the short term, there would be some resistance, especially from Poland, but eventually those regions would accept the new reality of their situation and deal with it. The last thing I would like to mention politically is butterflying away the assassination of Sergei Kirov, which played a huge factor in motivating Stalin to start purging his people, and with that being prevented, combined with Trotsky not becoming a political rival to Stalin, he will be way less paranoid, and his purges will be more similar to Putin in modern-day Russia. Have one guy accidentally fall down the stairs, another guy have a bad case of lead poisoning, another guy having a bad case of food poisoning, and have one guy's plane just stop working. You get the point. It will obviously be a larger scale than what Putin does, but it will not be a full-on genocide, more comparable to Kanye West's Political Idol did, and it will be more directed to Russians who actually likely oppose his rule. Moving back to the geopolitics of the Soviet Union, we will now move over to China, where I would like to change the earlier stages of the Chinese Civil War. The changes that I'm about to make are also the same changes that I made during my What If Everything Went Perfect for China video, except for the Soviet-aligned Wang Min gaining power eventually instead, so that way, after China reunifies, they'll be fully aligned to the Soviets. Anyways, the rest of the stuff that happened in my What If Everything Went Perfect for China video will happen in this alternate timeline as well, where we're going to prevent the nationalists from betraying the communists in the Shanghai Massacre, which led to the Long March, which ended in the Chinese Communist movement almost completely dying out, with about over 1 million Chinese communists losing their lives, which will now be prevented in this scenario, with Stalin being the one to betray the nationalists in this timeline and fully back the communists, who will make gains much earlier against the nationalists, which will give them a way better starting off point to be able to fight against the White Axis in this alternate World War II, which we're about to get into after we first get into the Great Depression, which would be happening during this time. As I touched on in my What If the Soviets Won the Polish-Soviet War video, in our timeline, the Soviets were not affected by it because their communist system was completely independent from the capitalist system the Allies had, which they used as a huge propaganda win. In this alternate timeline, this will be spread to all of Eastern Europe, where all of the Eastern European countries will also not be affected at all by the Great Depression. Now, imagine you're the average European citizen at this time. The system that your country has is currently failing, and your life is miserable. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, in multiple different countries, this revolution happened that introduced a brand new system of governance, and none of those countries are suffering from any of those economic problems that you're going through. Now, if I were living during this time period, I wouldn't know why communism is actually a horrible economic system, because it hasn't been implemented until this point in time. All I would see is that if you're a communist, you're prosper. And if you're not, then economic depressions can keep on happening, like the one you're going through now. So yeah, the communist movement would be way more bigger and prevalent than another timeline because of these successes. I'm sorry for the quick interruption, but by far, most of you guys are not subscribed, which you definitely should do because this channel is the most underrated alternate history channel on YouTube, and I have many amazing things planned for the channel, which I cannot do without the support from the community. So please show your support. We're also trying to get to 500 subscribers by the new year, so your subscription will also help me achieve that goal as well. If you're already subscribed, then please binge all my videos, as I've got an increasingly large catalog of videos for you to watch, and it also helps promote my channel in the algorithm. Without further ado, let's get back into the scenario. Fast forwarding to 1936, and the Soviets have spread their revolution to all of Eastern Europe and have started to invade Germany when the communists and the fascists start rising up and an alternate World War II begins. Now, the reason why all the Western European countries have started a coalition is because 1. The Soviets have completely disrupted the balance of power in Europe and have gained way too much power and influence, and 2. They now know that if they all don't act against the Soviets now, eventually, their countries will start communist revolutions of their own, which is exactly what's going to happen. I know, I'm really good at subtle foreshadowing. In all seriousness though, in our timeline, in Italy during this time, the communist movement was suppressed. However, it was still popular to the point where after World War II, the Allies were afraid that Italy would vote in a communist government, so in the peace treaty, they didn't lose any land so that they would have less of a reason to hate democracy. In France during this time, they had a communist party that after the 1936 election controlled 15% of the French parliament at the time, or 72 seats. Then Spain, of course, had the Spanish Civil War in Spain between 1936 and 1939, between the communists and the fascists, where the fascists won with support from the German political party that Kanye West would like to join. Then in the rest of the Western European countries, they had very little support, but they still have three very weak links. In this timeline, the communist support in Western Europe would be way higher because of the successes the Soviets would have. For the sake of the scenario, we will say that World War II starts in 1936. The Soviet Union and its satellite states would obviously be on the same side of what we will call the Red Axis, and on the side of what we will call the White Axis, we will have the fascist Germans, which would have rebranded potentially to the nationalists, to have better support from the rest, along with the Italians, who would want to prevent the further spread of communism, as well as gain more influence in the Balkans. The Spanish and the Japanese, who by this point would already technically be at war with the Soviets by proxy, with the Soviets supporting the communist Spanish factions against the nationalists during the Spanish Civil War, and the Soviets supporting the CCP and the rest of the Chinese warlord factions in fighting against the Japanese in warlord China. So Japan and Spain would both join in on the war so that they could gain support by the leader of the White Axis, Britain, along with Turkey, who would want revenge against the Soviets for taking Armenia from them. France and America would be the wild cards of the scenario. America would most likely fund the White Axis war efforts, however with France, they would be much more unpredictable in this scenario. The Communist Party historically wanted to be neutral in World War II, along with some of the left, during the invasion of Poland to honor the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that was signed between the Soviets and the Germans. However, things kind of got changed when they started to get their butts kicked in World War II. In this timeline, the situation would be way different. For starters, they wouldn't be going to war against just Germany, they would be going to war against the Soviets off the hop, which the Communists certainly wouldn't agree with. On top of that, the Communist Party would have many more seats in this timeline because of the success of communism in this timeline, so the left, who formed multiple coalitions on various issues in our timeline, could most likely control over half of France's parliament. The left would still be divided, however, as well as France's parliament as a whole. There would be the communists, as well as some of the left, who would support joining the war on the side of the communists, and the rest of the left, who would most likely support neutrality, as well as some other factions in the French government, likely as to prevent the communist citizens from potentially rebelling against the French government, and then the rest of the parliament who would support joining the war on the side of the Red Axis. The problem with France is that we simply don't know how much of France's parliament would support what side, so it's impossible to know whether or not they would join in on a side or be neutral. The most logical guess, which I would go with for the sake of the scenario, would be that France would definitely be neutral at the beginning of the war while they argue in Parliament about what side they should take. However, after they vote, I still think they would join in on the Right Axis eventually because of the fear the rest of the Parliament would have on communism spreading to France. The French Communist Party would still be loyal to Moscow and would still make up a really sizable portion of the Parliament, so they would use the support to launch massive pro-communist protests to join the side of the Soviet Union. With that all out of the way, we were going to get into the war. At first, the White Axis would be busy transporting troops into the Spanish Civil War to support the nationalists there, while also trying to send troops and supplies to the northeast of Germany. The communists would first start to push into the northwest as a result in order to cut nationalist Germany off from getting troops from Britain and supplies from the rest of the world. As a result of that defeat, Britain would no longer be able to supply nationalist Germany and would resort to begging the French to join the war along with the rest of the neutral countries around them, but it would be too late because the communists would blitzkrieg in to destroy the nationalists. The Soviets would also support Kurdish uprisings in the southwest Turkey and Iraq, as well as independence movements in Albania and Slovenia from Italy, while also supporting communist uprisings in Italy. The Soviets would push up to France's occupation zone, but wouldn't cross over to attempt to avoid getting them involved in the war against them, so that way they could see if the communists are able to prevent their entry. A lot of the French who do support neutrality would start viewing that once Germany is fully conquered, they would then try to take back the Rhineland and spread the revolution to France. So France will then officially join the war on the side of the white Axis. After that happens, the French communists would be furious about their government going to war against the communists, so the protests would soon turn into revolution, which the French are pretty good at doing. So the Soviets would start to support these communist revolutionaries to distract the French government a bit. The Soviets, in order to move into the Rhineland, will blitzkrieg into the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg and launch an attack on the Rhineland from behind. From here, the Soviets, instead of focusing on trying to collapse France from the outside like Germany did in our timeline, would instead try to collapse them from the inside through revolution and focus their manpower and resources on communist uprisings in France and Italy, which would continue to get bigger and bigger until eventually Soviet troops would move in using blitzkrieg, linking up with more and more revolutionaries until France and Italy are divided. And then the Soviets pick off the remaining of the loyalists until France surrenders. From there, focus is redirected fully towards the Italians, whose communist movement in our timeline was composed mainly in the region I have conquered in this region. So eventually, in this timeline when communism would be much more prevalent of an idea, the rest of these regions would still not have a lot of communist supporters, but that wouldn't matter because the Soviets would then blitzkrieg into the north, link up with all the communists in central Italy, and then conquer the south. While that's going on, troops would also move to link up with communist forces in the Spanish Civil War, and the front that has been mostly neglected by this point will now become extremely active, while also beginning the Battle of Britain by launching air and naval attacks on Britain from France. On the Spanish front, the Soviets would focus on finally defeating the nationalists, as well as conquering fascist Portugal, Denmark, and Norway to ensure that the British don't team up with them to try a counteroffensive. In Turkey by this point, Istanbul would have been conquered as well as a bunch of other important areas, which will eventually lead to them surrendering because they would still be very weak from the War of Independence, and in a matter of months, the communists have achieved what Elon Musk's daddy never could, conquering all of Europe, except for Switzerland and Austria, and Ireland, and Britain. But you get the point. So what do you guys think? Will the Soviets prevail, or will the White Axis make a surprising comeback? Spoiler alert, the Soviets will win because it's this scenario. Duh. How they will win, though, is up for interpretation, which will be revealed in part 2 of this 3-part series on what if everything went perfect for the Soviet Union. Until then, do me a huge favor and binge all my videos as I've got an increasingly large category of videos to choose from. And also don't forget to like and subscribe because I'm trying to reach 500 subscribers by the end of the year. And until next time, don't get anyone pregnant, but if you do, make sure they're hot. And I'll see you all in the next video. YouTube, please don't copyright me.